Who are you? Well, I didn't have time to drop a calling card. This is Miss,
Dale Arden.
nice name. And I'm Flash Gordon.
Gordon? Going to be taken to Ming, Emperor of the Universe. Your Majesty, we have captured the Earth people. Is there any resistance? No, Your Majesty, except from the blonde giant.
He fights well, the Earth man.
Your name, please.
Buck Rogers, Lieutenant Rogers officially.
And yours, my boy?
My name is George Wade, usually called Buddy.
We are witnesses to a scientific miracle. By means of a gas discovered by Professor Morgan, these two people have remained in a state of suspended animation for 500 years.
500 years?
Makes me old enough to be my own great-grandfather.
Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi, with me, James.
And me, Matt. Every series on this podcast, we explore the world of science fiction cinema by taking a trip through a different subgenre of sci-fi.
This series, our journey is through the fantastical world of space opera.
On today's episode, we are talking about the absolute heyday of space opera on screen. We're looking at two big Buster Crab film serials from the 1930s, two absolute classics, Flash Gordon from 1936 and Buck Rogers from 1939. 13 and 12 parts, 25 episodes of film serial space opera goodness we've watched for this week's episode, all of which available on YouTube, listeners, if you want to check it out. And I strongly recommend you do. James, how did you enjoy watching all these classics?
Oh, it was really, really interesting going back and seeing film serials in general, because this was a medium I hadn't really experienced before, because obviously we're used to TV shows now and television and sort of binge watching all of these series, all of these sci-fi series and whatnot. But the idea of the film serial, the movie serial that was happening in the 30s is such an interesting one, because people would go to the cinema to watch these little film shorts, which are about like 20 minutes long. They would go in there and that would be what they would watch before one of the main features. So did you know much about movie serials before doing this episode, Matt?
Well, no, and I don't think I'd ever watched one, not sort of consciously, but watching it, you do just realise that it's just television, really, isn't it? It's the format that will be carried forward into television and is still incredibly popular, of serialized dramatic storytelling. I was put in mind of stuff like Lost, definitely, in the storytelling, and particularly with the formatting and structure. Lots of anime shows do this style of storytelling. There's a big recap. There's only about 15 minutes of content per episode. And it always ends on a massive cliffhanger. I don't know if, anime doesn't always have the big cliffhanger, but the sort of big, lots of recapping and credits and then shorter episodes that lead into the next one feels like something that anime's picked up. That kind of serialization of storytelling is all very familiar, and it's lasted, over 100 years. And I suppose it's got its roots in serializing novels for newspapers, hasn't it? That type of storytelling to keep people hooked, but tell a longer story in bite-sized chunks. We're really just stepping into a little subsection of it here, but it suits space opera so well, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's interesting you brought up anime as well, because obviously anime is based on manga, which are basically comic books. And like you were saying, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, they started off as magazine serials. They were the little comics in newspapers. That's sort of how they got their start. And this is how film serials sort of came about, from what I understand. I think they began in 1912 and they were popular in sort of the first half of the 20th century. So they were created early on in film history as this kind of hybrid inspired by magazine serial sort of literature. The first film serial was one called What Happened to Mary. And that came out, and that was basically based on one of these magazines. And the format of these film serials is based on magazines and comic books. So if you think about it that way, the way that TV was spawned was born out of literature in a way.
And that's why they would have kind of collapsed in the middle of the 20th century, isn't it? Because the rise of the television is going to take away the interest in seeing this kind of storytelling, because you're getting it in your home, which makes sense, and it shifts the nature of the cinema offer. But what I was thinking when I was watching these was how much I would have loved to go to the cinema in the 1930s, see a big movie, but also you're going to get an episode of Buck Rogers. And I don't know if they would also pair that with like cartoons as well, or if it's like an either or, you get a serial or a cartoon. I don't know. But it just, and you had B movies as well. So you might see a matinee, see two films. It just feels like such a day out to go to the cinema back then. It just feels like a completely different experience. And now it's more, movies are so much bigger, and you expect to leave feeling like you've got your money's worth from just watching just a film, and trailers, if you like trailers or whatever. You don't get that whole experience of all this stuff going on, and there'd be newsreels as well, and it's a whole day.
Yeah, I think it just adds so much to a cinema experience. And the fact you couldn't watch any of this stuff at home, you couldn't sit and watch Netflix and binge all this stuff. You had to get out of the house and go to a cinema and experience this with an audience. And if you wanted to find out what happened next, you had to go back the next week, and then you'd have to sit back in a seat in the cinema and wait and see what happens to Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon. And you'd be waiting that entire week, wondering what's going to happen next.
And not being bingeable is quite important to the type of storytelling they do, noticeably in these two. With the best will in the world, they're quite repetitive. The same things tend to happen every week. So there's no expectation that you would watch all 12 in one go like we did in preparation for this. So there is a different kind of style of storytelling there. It's not bingeable. You are supposed to come back to it week by week. And it also allows for writing that you don't actually need to see the previous episode. First of all, there's the recaps, the quite iconic, particularly in this Buck Rogers one. The crawl made more iconic by the Star Wars movies. But that stuff to recap where you're at. And also, it's the same. If you did catch one 3 weeks ago, don't worry. Buck's going to be doing the same thing. Flash is up to the same thing. It's pretty familiar stuff each week. And we're going to fill you in on the gaps, and we'll show you the cliffhanger from the last episode anyway. So you know exactly what's going on each time.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this as well. It's kind of like how Saturday morning cartoons worked as well, because you'd get up early and you'd watch your favourite cartoon, and then you'd wait the next week to find out what happened to the characters. And again, that works like anime, it works like all of these different kind of things. But this, interestingly enough, wasn't meant to be sort of a kid's audience necessarily. And film serials had developed this children's audience, and they'd been catering for that audience over time. For whatever reason, it just sort of morphed into that. And bearing in mind, it's very close to the silent era of film. Sound is only a very relatively new invention in cinema at this point. And Universal really wanted to get this adult audience back into the cinema to watch these film serials. So that's one of the reasons why Flash Gordon came about, because it was supposed to appeal to a more adult audience, which I find really interesting because it's sci-fi, and surely it would appeal to kids. So it's kind of got this mix of audiences they're trying to get with this series with Flash Gordon in 1936.
Yeah, and in the broadest sense, I would say space opera is a type of sci-fi that does have that appeal with kids. We're going to be talking about some films this series that don't, but by and large, it's child-friendly, family-oriented entertainment for the most part. But it's that kind of adult audience entertainment that just has an appeal because it's adventurous and fun. It's the same as Westerns would have been very appealing to younger audiences. They tend to be quite violent, but it's a kind of violence that kids like. Kids are sort of naturally attracted to action and violence in entertainment. They love it. It's easy to follow and it's exciting. So Westerns would be very popular, and so would Flash and Buck. It's gonna translate very well to a young audience.
So we talked a little bit about the audience. We should talk about this film, or this film serial in particular. The first one we are looking at is Flash Gordon from 1936. So how much do you know about the production of this serial and the sort of genesis of this character of Flash Gordon, Matt?
I don't know a lot. I mean, Flash Gordon to me is just 1980 Flash Gordon. This was actually a real treat to watch because of how similar it is. I didn't realise that the 1980 movie was essentially a remake of this. There's a lot more plot in the serial because there's 13 episodes, but the bare bones of it, the encounter, the plane crash, the encounter with Zarkov, the way they get there, a good deal of the structure of that amazing classic film is just taken and remade from this serial. So it felt incredibly familiar, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. But I had never seen it before. I didn't really know anything about it. I don't really know anything about Flash Gordon outside of this story and the movie that I love.
Yeah, I was in exactly the same boat because the movie, the one that we all know, is so iconic now, and so many people have seen it. It's very much in the mainstream now, isn't it? Whereas this is kind of, it's no one's going back. Like, there's a very few people which are going back and watching the 1930s Flash Gordon episodes and even reading the comics, I would say. But the comics, interestingly enough, they had such a long run. They were going on for years and years. They first started in 1934, and then they went on to about 92, and then I think they got
92, wow.
But I think they carried on again. I think they went on again after that till 2007 or something.
Wow.
They had a ridiculously long run of Flash Gordon comics. And it's interesting because this character was initially a knockoff of Buck Rogers. So Buck Rogers was the big comic strip at the time, was the first big sort of comic book that was around. And then King Feature Syndicate, which are the guys which made Flash Gordon, wanted to create their own sort of spaceman superhero for their comic strip. So they asked their illustrator, Alex Raymond, and their writer, Don Moore, to work together and create this character. So Alex Raymond came up with Flash Gordon, who was basically just using the cutout from Buck Rogers and then trying to create something new.
Very funny then also to get Buster Crabbe, get the same actor to play those two characters in their big adaptations on screen for movie serials. Because, and we'll come on to this, I guess, when we get into Buck Rogers, but they're so similar, aren't they? I think I've got a bias towards Flash Gordon in that I feel like he's a better character, but I know what that bias is. It's because I'm predisposed to love Flash Gordon. So I think I've got a bias there, but they're basically the same guy, aren't they? I think he's slightly more blonde in the Flash Gordon serial, and that's about it.
Yeah, well, he's properly blonde in the Flash Gordon ones because they got him to dye his hair blonde for the serial, right, which he hated apparently. He was just like, I look like a fool, so he was wearing hats all the time when he was going around when he had his hair dyed for this. But the interesting thing as well is how this adaptation came about. So there was a producer called Henry McRae who was buying up all of the rights to King Feature Syndicate, which were doing all these comic strips. They did a serial called Tailspin Tommy before this, which was based again on those comic strips. He had a budget of $350,000, which was huge at the time. And he was like, right, I want to make this Flash Gordon serial. So he had to sort of beg and borrow to get it made from various bits and pieces that Universal had laying around. So if you look at it, they've got sets from The Mummy, Bride of Frankenstein, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame in there.
Right, okay. Oh, I did wonder. The sets are amazing.
Yeah, but also, which this blew my mind a bit, so they've lifted bits from this sci-fi comedy which came out in 1930 called Just Imagine. So there's a brief scene in the first few episodes with some dancing girls and there's this big idol with moving arms.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that bit is just taken from this other film. So it's a whole bit that's just taken from there. And this was quite common with Universal. They were taking lots of bits and using it in other stuff. Like, I think it's the Beast from The Fathoms of the Depth. I can't remember the exact title, but I think it's the Beast from 50,000 Fathoms. Okay. There's a scene from Flash Gordon in that, apparently. I'm not 100% sure on that. But again, it's just this idea that Universal is taking stuff from all of its different products and being like, right, we'll use a bit of this. And even the score in this it's only got one original piece. The rest are bits and pieces from films like The Black Cat and The Invisible Man. And it's only the main theme song, which was composed specifically for the serial.
That definitely doesn't surprise me, because I did notice that the main theme of Buck Rogers is a musical cue that crops up a couple of times in Flash Gordon. So they're reusing even within these two properties. Yeah, and that's just how the studio system kind of made a load of money, wasn't it? Because you have this economy of scale with a studio. So if you've got stuff to use, then you use it and your production costs go down. And even though you're spending 350 grand on it, which is a lot of money, but it could have been a lot more if you had to recreate all of those scenes. But it just allows you to make a bigger looking production for less money, sell it to the cinemas for a load of money, and it's highly profitable and addictive watching because of the storytelling structure. It's a pretty good business model. Like, you can see very clearly how it would have worked so well, because it's just a very good capitalist way of making entertainment, isn't it?
Yeah, and they just pumped so much money into this, but at the same time, they had such a tight schedule. I think they had like 6 weeks in total to film the entirety of this serial.
Wow.
Which is just crazy. So they were doing like 2.5 episodes a day or something.
Good Lord.
Just to sort of like get it out the door, which is mad. But I think it all comes down to the fact that this character of Flash Gordon, although he may have been based on a different character, he still has something special about him. I think that's why audiences loved it so much, because obviously you've got Buster Crabbe, who is this Olympian swimmer. He won a gold medal beforehand. This monster of a man. He's like an Adonis of the 30s. He's kind of like how Arnie is to us in our generation. Imagine seeing this guy, Buster Crabbe, who is clearly in top physical shape, and he's going around throwing all of these enemies about. He's fighting dragons and monsters and aliens and all this kind of stuff. And again, talking about the sort of the budget of it, they've got live animals all over the place in this serial.
The animal welfare stuff is extremely troubling. Voltan slaps a real bear on the ass.
I know.
And it's not a stunt guy slapping the bear. It's the guy who plays Voltan. And it's a real bear. And he slaps it on the ass when it's leaving the scene.
And it's a bear that's been painted to look a bit like a skunk as well.
Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely crazy.
I mean, that's the least of it. I mean, there's the scene where a real shark appears to kill an octopus. It's just, there's so much that you simply couldn't do just a few years later.
Yeah.
And the tiger that attacks...
The tiger, yeah.
I mean, I don't think
he's really wrestling a tiger in all of the shots.
I think someone is. I don't think it's really Gene Rogers, but there's a stunt double there, I think, hugging a trained tiger, but still.
Yeah, so they've got that, and then they've got the lizards at the start, which are supposed to be... The shots are quite clever for the time period. They've made them look like giant lizards and dragons, which are just on this planet.
This is what makes this so entertaining and quite a timeless thing. Obviously, the animal stuff some of it's a bit cringy, but in terms of the special effects and the production value, it's such a treat to watch. It's so fun. And also reusing those sets works so well because those sets are so brilliant, and mise-en-scène and sets are so important to space opera. It needs to look fantastical and amazing and, take your breath away a little bit. And it has to have that scale and scope. And they manage that in this serial. And I think it really stands the test of time because of those factors. And Buster Crabbe, I mean, you're talking about him being an Adonis of a man. He's absolutely gorgeous as well. He's really charming, really good looking fella. And also like by modern standards of beauty, because sometimes you see like bodybuilders from like the end of the 1800s and you're like, it's like a fat guy, but even with modern eyes, he's a really charming, good looking bloke, and he's brilliant in these serials. He really just makes the role his own, and it's a really iconic performance from him. Gene Rogers, there's loads of great stuff.
It's got a great cast, but we should also talk about the story of Flash Gordon. So what the hell is Flash Gordon about then, Matt? What would you what would you say the plot is of this film serial?
So the basic plot is, if you're familiar with the 1980 film, as many of our listeners will be, it is basically that Flash is kidnapped. Flash and Dale Arden, who don't appear to have any connection or anything at the start of the film, are basically kidnapped by a slightly rogue scientist, Dr. Hans Zarkov, formerly of NASA, had no explanation for. Dr. Hans Zarkov kidnaps them and flies them to a planet that is on a collision course with Earth, the planet Mungo or Mongo, which is ruled by the evil tyrant Emperor Ming the Merciless. And the basic plot is that gang of Earth heroes are trying to stop Ming from taking over the world, galaxy, universe, whatever his intention is. And within that plot, every episode, Flash is just getting into some scrape, hanging out with some group of mad humanoid people mixed with some kind of animal, getting into fights with monsters. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. But the basic plot is we're trying to stop Ming from taking over the world or destroying Earth.
Yeah, but it's the adventures, isn't it? It's all of those adventures he's going on, which is what keeps you in the cinema watching these serials week after week in the 30s. And like you were saying, all of the crazy alien races that he meets. So you've got like the Hawkmen and the Sharkmen and the Lionmen, and every sort of animal you can think of is in there. But when he meets each of these groups, there's some sort of fun adventure. Like the Sharkmen episode is quite early on, and it's shot underwater, and you've got all of these great like water scenes. That's so exciting to watch. And then later when you meet the Hawkmen, and you've got the amazing character of King Voltan, and there's just so much going on in this, and it really leans into the fantasy elements, which we talked about in the first episode, because space opera is also classed as sort of space fantasy. And I think having all of these crazy creatures and places and adventures happening here, there, and everywhere really makes it fantastical. And also, even just in the styling of what these people are wearing, it's not all sort of futuristic spacesuits and things like that. There is a bit of that, but it's also it harks back to sort of medieval times, Roman times, Greek times, in the aesthetics of what they're wearing. It's very romanticized, the way they're dressed. Classical.
Yeah, it leans into sort of historical fiction as well, and that's interesting with the other types of serials, I guess, that would have been popular. I know Buster Crabbe played Tarzan as well, so I wonder what the kind of cast of characters that support Tarzan's adventures might look like, and if they fall into the similar sort of categories that we see here. I wouldn't be too surprised to see some of the same things, Roman style headdresses and things like that. I imagine that would crop up. Here we're just casting them as coming from another planet, you know.
Your eyes, your hair, your skin. I've never seen one like you before. Ah, you are beautiful.
You keep your slimy hands off her, and you grab him!
And you also mentioned a bit about Emperor Ming earlier on, played by Charles Middleton. There's just something so menacing about Emperor Ming. And also this, bearing in mind that this came out in 1936, so it's not far off when you get a real life evil dictator coming to the forefront with Hitler in World War II. So I think all of that kind of feeds into making this character even more despicable, this idea of this emperor who is in charge of an entire planet, and he's got all of these forces that can take over a world, and I think there's a lot in there, isn't there?
Yeah, Hitler's in power by the time this comes out. I think that Ming feels more fun and innocent, but obviously a sort of dictator with world domination on his mind is obviously familiar. I mean, for me, what made him so great is just the character design, the costume, the appearance, the shaved head. He looks totally iconic. He looks like a comic book character. They've captured perfectly that rendition of him on screen. And Charles Middleton just has this commanding presence. I was probably most impressed by his performance. I love Buster Crabbe, but in my mind, you've got Max von Sydow, in his performance in 1980, which is extremely hard to top. But Charles Middleton's just there with this amazing commanding presence, completely convincing as this tyrannical dictator bent on world domination / world destruction, whatever it takes. No one can stand in my way. He's absolutely vicious, cartoonishly vicious, in a brilliant way. He's a fantastic enemy for Flash to go up against.
Yeah, and I read somewhere he kind of took inspiration from this character of Dr. Fu Manchu, who was a supervillain introduced in a series of novels before sort of World War One. And obviously there's some dodgy racial connotations that they're sort of flagging up with that kind of character. But all in all, Emperor Ming is this terrifying character, yet he's got this daughter who is infatuated with Flash, and she's constantly running after him and sets up this kind of love triangle that's going on throughout the series of her being Princess Aura, played by Priscilla Lawson, and Dale Arden, played by Gene Rogers. So what did you think about the sort of the love aspect of this and this weird triangle that's going on throughout?
I think that it kind of works for like a comic strip adaptation, because I guess a lot of audiences at the time would have been familiar with the setup and these relationships would be well established. Like, I don't know, I haven't read the strips, but I'm imagining Aura is, whenever she crops up, she's got some scheme to get Flash to leave Dale and fall in love with her, something like that. It's all very weird when you condense it down into a film serial where these characters have just met like the day before. I don't know what the timescale of events in the plot is, but I think it works. I mean, it's just it adds an element of fun to it. I think it almost like a screwball comedy from the time, this kind of love triangle set up, except with a layer of menace, because Aura's willing to mind wipe Flash, which is not a very nice thing to do. Yeah, kind of a horrible move on her part. I
think Aura's a far more interesting character, though, because she just does all of these crazy things to try and get Flash to fall in love with her. Like, I think there's a love potion at one point and all of this kind of crazy stuff. Whereas Dale is she's mainly just playing the damsel in distress a lot of the time.
She does squeal a lot, doesn't she?
Yeah, lots of squealing. But, I mean, Gene Rogers' performance is great, but there is just something about Priscilla Lawson as Aura that is just captivating on screen. She's just, I don't know what it is. I think it's just because her character is doing more interesting stuff.
Yeah, she is more interesting. I think it's that it's something about the way that she's ostensibly one of the good guys. She's in love with Flash, so she's going to help Flash, and she has to sort of learn over the course of the story to be a good guy, to be a hero in order to impress Flash, rather than wipe his brain and force him to fall in love. So she ostensibly becomes a good guy, but she takes after her father. We know how evil Ming is, and she's his daughter, and she does take after him. She's manipulative and will do whatever it takes to get what she wants. But where what he wants is to destroy the Earth, what she wants is to shag Flash. So she's willing to go to similar measures as her father Ming would, but her goals are less galactically threatening. So that makes her a slightly more interesting character, because you can sort of see those shades in her, but she's willing to become a good guy in order to impress this man that she's just met and really fancies.
Yeah, whereas Flash just is solely interested in Dale the entire time. He pushes Aura back many a time, and in the background you've got this character of Prince Baron who has the hots for Aura as well. So again, you've got him in the background. And it's so fascinating watching these characters just go on their little hijinks throughout. It seems like every episode has some sort of big tournament battle where Flash has to fight for his life. In a few episodes, he ends up topless because it's Buster Crabbe and everyone wants to see his muscles. And the serial just has this pacing to it where it's just there's constantly action happening at the end of it to keep people coming back. I mean, some of the explanations as to what happened in the previous episode afterwards and just sort of jumping, it seems like it jumps a few times in the episodes. They'll be in some scrape at the end of last one and then it'll just be resolved really quickly. Yeah.
We looked at the rules of space opera, but what I was noticing was there's rules in film serials as well, isn't there? Which is everything has to end on a cliffhanger, but normally that cliffhanger is resolved by either there was a guy around the corner with a gun who shoots the guy who was threatening the hero, or if there was a big explosion, it just wasn't that bad. That's what happens the next week. It's just like, whoa, that was a bad explosion. I'm glad I didn't get exploded, but I didn't get exploded. So let's crack on and go back and fight the bad guys. That I was noticing that with every episode. And obviously with binge watching it does become a little more silly because you're not experiencing that cliffhanger over a week. You're going straight in and then it's just like, oh, Flash was just next to the rubble, not underneath the rubble. So it's fine.
Lots of little easy ways to get him out of those situations.
And you were talking about the way he's always meeting a new guy. I love that development of the gang around Flash because, in the sort of first 2/3 of the serial, he's just like meeting a new set of characters every episode or fighting a new monster or something like that. But by the end, he has got this established crew that he's friends with. We've got Prince Thun, King Voltan, Prince Baron, Aura, Zarkov is off doing his science stuff, and Dale is screaming and fainting around. But that gang kind of like coalesces around Flash for an actual sort of showdown at the end. And I imagine that would have been incredibly satisfying if you'd waited 13 weeks for it and been to the cinema 13 weeks in a row. You do get quite a satisfying showdown at the end of this, don't you? And a real conclusion. And it's a really great ending, I thought.
Yeah, and also just through that progression as well, you're seeing all of this crazy sci-fi technology being used, and it is quite hammy looking at it now, like the mind control device that they've got and the invisibility ray or whatever it is.
I love the invisibility machine.
It's great. Yeah. Things like that, and then the way that the spaceships are flying around, it's all such a spectacle. And you've got to remember that this is the series which inspired Star Wars, like you said at the start. Yeah. So much of Star Wars came from Flash Gordon and this original serial. So to see that at the cinema at the time, it would have just blown your mind to see all of these crazy adventures happening. But going back to the finale and how it all sort of wraps up towards the end of the series, one of the things I was surprised about was how quickly Emperor Ming has just exited from the series. Yeah. There's no big fight between Flash and Ming. Ming just kind of gives up and then walks off to his death.
Yeah, very bizarre. I thought that there was going to be more of a cliffhanger so that we'd have a promise of him coming back. But yeah, he just walks to his death. Especially because his high priest or whatever, his right-hand man is still out there sabotaging Flash's ship. I assumed there was going to be some reveal, like in the movie, where Ming's hand claims his magical ring at the end of the movie. Some kind of cliffhanger that sets up that he's going to return and Flash must return to Mungo to defeat him again. But yeah, I was a bit sad to see Charles Middleton's character give up so easily, really.
Yeah, I mean, they did do sequels, though, didn't they? They did another couple of film serials. Flash Gordon's Trip to Mars, which was another 15 episodes or chapters. And then they did Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe as well. So Universal were really making their money out of Flash Gordon at this point.
Yeah, well, of course, why not? I think it's a winning formula. I wonder if the other ones would actually hold up as well as this one does. But I'd be tempted to watch more Flash Gordon.
I just want to see if Ming comes back somehow.
Yeah, he's got to be back on Mars, hasn't he?
Surely. You can't get rid of a character like Ming.
No.
But we talked about a space opera checklist as well previously in the other episode. So how much of that checklist do you think is summed up in Flash Gordon?
Shall we just recap that list quickly? We've got the world must be in peril. There must be a quest, a man or woman to meet the mighty hour, The man or woman must confront aliens and exotic creatures. Space must flow past the ports like wine. Blood must rain down the palace steps. Ships launch out into the lowering dark. There must be a man or woman fairer than the skies. I think we've got two in this one. And a villain darker than a black hole. And all must come right in the end. I mean, just reading through that, I think we've got all of them, apart from maybe space flowing past the ports, which only happens a few times and at the beginning and the end.
Yeah, there's not too much space travel, is there? I mean, they seem to just be travelling around the planet quite a bit, so they're not... But other than that, they've got everything in there from the sounds of it. They've got...
high scoring.
Yeah, definitely. It checks all the boxes of our space opera checklist.
Shall we move on and talk about Buster Crabbe's other iconic sci-fi film serial, Buck Rogers from 1939?
Let's. Hi listeners, if you're enjoying the show and want to support what we do, you can sign up to our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Journey Through Sci-Fi.
And if you subscribe at the warp speed level, you'll get access to our regular bonus episodes as well as the whole back catalogue.
We've got a host of mini-series like deep dives into the Terminator and Planet of the Apes franchises, as well as the Bad Movie Bunker and reviews of the latest sci-fi films.
Plus, you'll get a say in the kind of content we make for our patrons.
We hope to see you there.
Beyond the jet plane, beyond the atomic bomb, beyond the time machine, and all the scientific marvels of tomorrow, there is Buster Crabbe as Buck Rogers. Thrill as Buck and his sidekick Buddy are discovered after 500 years of suspended animation.
Who is this man called Killer Kane?
He is the result of the stupidity of the men of your century.
Still at the villainy of Killer Kane, the most despicable despot ever to menace the galaxy.
There's no time to lose. We must attack Hidden City immediately.
So what is Buck Rogers to you? We talked about Flash Gordon in the 1980 movie. What's Buck Rogers mean to you?
Well, Buck Rogers from the 25th century is how I remember Buck Rogers. That TV series, which I think we got over here in the UK, and it was in that golden slot, which we always chat about on this show, the BBC to 6 o'clock to 6:45 slot. They were showing old episodes of Buck Rogers there. And that is the way that I remember Buck Rogers. But I don't really remember much about what happened in it. I remember he had a little robot and he was flying around in a spaceship, and that's pretty much it.
I'm exactly the same. I remember loving it. And I can picture the opening credits quite vividly. And I think if I heard the theme tune, it would really trigger some intense nostalgia for me. And I remember loving it, but I can't remember any of it. I would have watched every episode. The little robot was called Tweaky, I think. And that's about it. That's all I can remember. But that's Buck Rogers to me. And of course, a song by Feeder.
Of course, the Feeder song. This was another sort of interesting deep dive as well, just seeing what this character was like and all of the things that he went on to inspire. So in the original comic books, Buck Rogers was born in the late 1800s. He participated in the First World War. He grew up, and then after that, he joined the American Radioactive Gas Corporation.
Okay.
Yeah, I know, mad. And then he was working in a mine. The mine caves in, and for whatever reason, this gas that's in the mine put him in a coma, and then he wakes up almost 500 years later. That's what happens in the comic books. And then also what happens is he ends up fighting the Mongol Reds, who have emerged from the Gobi Desert to conquer Asia and Europe and attacked America. And it's sort of like the Mongols are the evil people in the comics. And obviously, that's a little bit dodgy now when you look at it.
Yeah, sounds like the original author had a particular axe to grind.
Yeah. So they've kind of got rid of that in the serial. And the serial's just fascinating as well, isn't it? Because like we said, Buck Rogers is the character that inspired Flash Gordon. Both have very monosyllabic names, don't they? Buck Rogers, Flash
Buck
Gordon.
Rogers, Buck, Flash. Yeah.
Exactly. So you can remember them. And that's exactly why Buck Rogers got his name. Originally, it was going to be Anthony Rogers, which doesn't really have
Anthony Rogers. That sounds like
Ant Rogers or something like that.
Right.
But the guy who created him, Dick Colkins,
also a good name.
so him and writer Philip Nolan, they created Buck Rogers, and they went, no, we're going to call him William, and the nickname will be Buck, because it's like Buck Jones, who was a famous Western star at the time. Nice and easy to remember.
Yeah, that's good. How does Buck derive from William, or is it not related? It's just we just call him Buck. It's a nickname.
I'm not that up on nicknames like that, but I'm just going to go with it's just a catchy nickname. Let's just go with that.
I mean, Flash makes more sense because it's a word. Buck, like a horse bucks. I don't know. What did you think of him as a character then? Because he's got this he's got this unique backstory of being suspended in stasis for 500 years, which seems to carry across various different interpretations of him wherever he's being portrayed. He's a man from present day at the time of the production being made who falls asleep somehow for 500 years and then wakes up in the future.
He's a man out of time. Now,
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, it does. It reminds me of the films that we looked at in our time travel series, Planet of the Apes and Demolition Man, that had that kind of setup. And there's a similar problem that I felt with those films, but they deal with them in different ways, which is it's hard to get away from that origin story of the character because it's an insane thing to happen to a human being. And Planet of the Apes deals with it fantastically. There's all that dialogue at the start of the film where he's a complete nihilist, so he's loving it, and then his crewmates are seemingly going insane with the concept of being thousands of years in the future. Buck just crashes a dirigible, falls asleep for 500 years, wakes up, and just immediately becomes like a space hero.
It's just Commander in less than a day.
Yeah. And he loves it. But there's never any consideration to his origin. His origin is so far-fetched, complicated, and feels important because it's so far-fetched. But it's actually the least important thing about Buck Rogers' character that he's a man out of time from our time, at least in this portrayal. I wonder if the 1970s TV series at least makes some more jokes about it or something. I'm sure they don't get into the horrifying psychology of having that happen to you, but yeah.
It's very much brushed under the carpet in this, isn't it?
Yeah. And Buddy as well. He's got a child with him at all times.
Yeah, he's got a child with him. His child friend who just is going along on his adventures. But it also reminded me of Captain America. Because it's just Captain America, isn't it? It's the same story.
And Bucky.
And Bucky, because Bucky was a little kid that he was hanging around with. And it's worth noting that both Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon were massive influences on DC and Marvel.
Yeah.
Because I think if you look at all of the characters in the early sort of DC comics and stuff, they are like Flash Gordon, and obviously we just cited Captain America as being like Buck Rogers. All of these things are borrowing from each other, which I think is great. But having Buck Rogers as this initial character who has this backstory, and it's such an iconic backstory that it's going to get used in science fiction again and again and again. This kind of Rip Van Winkle story of this man out of time.
And these things go in waves, don't they? And Buck Rogers has fallen down below the surface of those waves. And Flash Gordon ripped off Buck Rogers, rode very high, amazing serials, iconic, not universally loved movie in the 1980s, and further attempts to reboot Flash Gordon over the years. But Buck Rogers had this resurgence in the 70s where he would have been a big deal again, but haven't heard much from him since. And now, obviously, Captain America dominating culture in the Marvel universe. But it's a character that could easily be rebooted. I can easily see Buck Rogers having another remake and another resurgence and just casting him as a 2020s guy or 2030s guy whenever they make it, 500 years in the future, and just do the whole thing again. And let's get into the psychology of being frozen for 500 years.
Yeah, we need to see it on screen. We need to see what that would do to you mentally.
I want to see Buck Rogers cry.
It's all you've ever wanted, Matt, I know. But also the interesting thing about this as well is we talked about Western serials and sort of like the horse opera in the previous episode. So Buck Rogers was the kind of start of the space opera, and you're seeing a shift from cowboys to spacemen and astronauts and things like that. And obviously everything that's happening at the time in America is reflected in Buck Rogers, because you've got space travel becoming a possibility, and you've got all of the leaps and bounds that they're doing in sort of all of those fields. And all of a sudden, the youth of America aren't concerned with cowboys and horses and all that kind of stuff. They want to see spaceships and cool ray guns and all of this kind of stuff on screen. So Buck Rogers really tapped into that. And then off the back of that, Flash Gordon did the same thing. So another sort of interesting reference point for this is what they did in Toy Story, because you've got Woody as this cowboy toy, and then you've got Buzz Lightyear as this cool new spaceman with lasers and stuff. So that's reflecting what actually happened in popular culture, because you went from horse operas to space operas.
I guess Buck having that backstory that isn't really acknowledged, and then he just sort of steps into the role, that's important for that kind of category of film, because he's no different, I would imagine, from a horse opera hero. They're slightly two-dimensional characters. I think, both Flash and Buck are fairly two-dimensional, aren't they? And the fact that he can fall asleep for 500 years and then immediately wake up and become a commander for the hidden city speaks to him being a fairly two-dimensional character. He's able, he comes with no baggage to this story, so he's very able to step into that role as a character. And that's important for a film serial, isn't it? Because the character needs to be able to step into a new role every week and just be fighting a new enemy with little setup and little need for any backstory. So there's no time to get hung up on his backstory. He needs to be that kind of a person. And I imagine most film serial heroes would be like that for that reason, wouldn't they?
Yeah, you need to get straight into the action as quickly as possible. And you mentioned a bit about how he's different from Flash Gordon. Obviously, his backstory is different, but there's also other aspects of him, because I feel like his character is more reflective of what's happening at the time, because he's like an Air Force pilot, isn't he? He's actively going out and fighting the bad guys in this, the bad guys being Killer Kane, amazing name, and his outlaw cronies. And the fact that they're outlaws as well, they're described as something specifically, aren't they?
Racketeers, but specifically they're super racketeers. I thought that was very funny, because I had to try and think of what a racketeer actually is, because it's not a big thing in modern culture, but clearly in 1939 it was a serious social issue. It's organised crime, but we don't talk about organised crime in terms of racketeering, I wouldn't say, these days. Obviously, organised crime is always going to be a problem, but talking about them as racketeers is anachronistic and slightly funny, I think. They're running a racket, and the racket that they run has got so big, it's taken over the entire planet Earth because you guys in 1939 didn't do enough about it.
Yeah, they're future gangsters, aren't they? And they've got all the sort of the American gangster prohibition era kind of sensibilities to them when you watch them. I mean, Killer Kane looks like an Al Capone or something like that, doesn't he? He's got his like slick back hair and he's got his stripy suit, except he is also the person who's running the world, from the sounds of it, with his hired thugs.
Yeah, so I wonder if there's an attempt to make a slightly more socially conscious or social commentary space opera film serial here. I would say it's to the detriment of the film, because if you compare Killer Kane, who has this basis on mobsters of the 1930s, basically, he's nowhere near, not even on the same page of being as iconic as Ming. Ming is cartoonish and larger than life, and I think that's why nearly 100 years later he still looks amazing and it's still an iconic villain to fight. And then trying to do something that maybe seems like it's more based on the real world, a little bit more in Buck Rogers. To be honest, I don't think it holds up. I think it makes it more dated, or not even necessarily dated, but just less entertaining, I would say.
Because that is the interesting thing, because Flash Gordon is so out there and fantastical, whereas, like you just said, Buck Rogers is very grounded in what's happening at the time and this kind of realism. And that's why you've got Buck just flying around trying to beat up the gangsters the whole time, and then make peace treaties as well with these people that live on Saturn. So that's the other sort of main part of the plot, isn't it? They're constantly flying over to Saturn with his mates Wilma and Buddy, and he's going over there to make peace treaties the whole time and try and get them on his side so that they can overthrow Killer Kane.
Yeah, and again, we might be looking at more social commentary here. You'd be getting stuff like Germany and Russia are signing non-aggression treaties and stuff like that in Europe. There's all sorts of non-aggression or peace or cooperation treaties being signed in the lead up to the Second World War. This comes out in 1939, so I don't actually know how much of those would have actually happened to influence this, but it's possible that's the sort of thing it's making a commentary on. But again, for my money, it makes it less interesting. And it's weird. It's almost contradictory for me that Buck has more personality and more character and more background than Flash does. Flash is a man on a plane who we know plays polo, and that's about it. And I like him so much more than Buck, who has some sort of history as a pilot, both seemingly professionally. I think he's got some sort of military background, it seems like, and then he does some sports flying or something like that at the start of this serial. That's all explained. He's a sort of ready-made adventurer, and we see a little glimpse of it, and we know that about him. And he's also interested in joining this political rebellion cause of the hidden city. I just don't find that as exciting of a space opera character. And I don't know why, to be honest with you, because on paper, all of that stuff is more interesting and he is a much richer character. And maybe it's just the quality of the production is a bit lower, but I much prefer Flash Gordon. I think Flash Gordon is more fun. I think it makes Buck a bit more too serious for the format.
It's really interesting, because I would have thought you would have leaned more towards this one, because I feel like this inspired so many other TV series, because one of the things I kept thinking about was how it's the early kind of Battlestar, because of the way that they've got this sort of community trying to fight against this evil group, and they're flying around trying to... It's very political, this, and I think maybe the politics in it kind of take away from the fun that you would want in a space opera.
That's the problem, I think. I've got no problem with Battlestar Galactica. I love Battlestar Galactica, and it's interesting to see potential links or influences between the two.
Starbuck?
Yeah, of course. But I think it's because the format is a space opera serial, and I think it needs to be less serious than that. I don't actually want that. If I want that, I'll watch Battlestar Galactica. I'll watch post 9/11 space opera. But this 1930s cinema serial, I prefer it when it's a lot lighter than Buck Rogers. But I don't mind the characterization. Like, I think some of the concepts, like the hidden city or whatever it's called, that's a cool concept. But in practice, it just doesn't work.
It's also worth thinking about the fact that this is probably one of the first instances of sci-fi reflecting the zeitgeist. World War II on the horizon. You've got all of these things which are in the public mindset. And this is like a precursor to that. And it's showing this battle against this evil dictator again. This Killer Kane, this guy who is going to... He's going to enslave the human race as well. He turns them into robots, or robots, as they call them.
Yeah, the robots. Yeah, like Dr. Zoidberg. Yeah, there's some great sci-fi tech, isn't there? The robot helmets are really cool, and I love the degravity belts that they wear instead of parachuting. That's a brilliant little sci-fi gadget to just drop into things, isn't it? Those things are really fun, and the space battles are excellent as well.
Yeah, and they've got these little floating communicators, which seem a bit pointless, but whenever they talk to someone, they've got this little floating, I don't even know what it is, like bit that they speak into, which is hilarious.
Yeah.
And the stuff that you see on screen is quite well done, because whenever they have messages on screen and they're talking to people via like a video call, you see this thing pop up on the screen. And I feel like when I was watching that, I was really impressed with how that looks for a serial made in 1939.
Yeah, very Star Trek, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
View screens and all of that. It looks great. They have that in Flash Gordon as well, though.
Yes, okay, Matt. I know you're a big Flash Gordon fan.
All right, well, let's talk about the characters then. We talked a bit about Buck and Buddy. What about Wilma, and what about the kind of trio that they make at the heart of this serial? What did you think of all that?
Well, I think Wilma really gets sidelined, doesn't she? She's supposed to be the second sort of lead character. She's the female lead, isn't it, in this film? There's not any other women in the film.
Well, it's interesting you think she's sidelined. She's not, she's certainly sidelined in the last few episodes where she sort of disappears for a while. I was quite impressed for a 1939 sci-fi story that we had such a strong female lead. I think she's great. I thought, yeah, disappearing her a little bit in the last few episodes was disappointing. The biggest disappointment for me was that Buck and Wilma like get together at the end when there had been absolutely no romantic tension between them. And I was quite enjoying the fact that she was, you know, a respected, highly decorated military leader, very confident and leading missions and all of that. I thought she was a really cool female character to have, like I said, in a sci-fi from this time. And I was most impressed by it not being that very standard man-woman romance thing going on. So just at the very end, I guess it's okay because it was literally just like the last minute, so it doesn't really diminish much. You can sort of ignore it. But I was a bit like, oh, what's that? Where's that come from? This is...
Yeah, you're right, though. She's like a decorated pilot, which I think is amazing for a film of this period. And also, I kept thinking about how audiences would have responded to this when they were watching it. So if you're sort of an older person watching this in the cinema, you kind of put yourself in Buck's shoes. And if you're a woman, you'd be Wilma. And then if you're a young kid watching this, you'd want to be sort of mates with Buck, and you'd want to be buddy, basically.
Yeah.
And showing this young kid on screen running around after Buck and joining in on the adventures kind of, it puts you in that space, and it makes you believe as a kid, oh, maybe if I was mates with Buck and I'd been flying over this storm and then this gas had happened, then I would have ended up in the future and I could be fighting all of these evil people and flying off to Saturn and having all of these adventures.
Yeah, you're right. It's like there's clear lessons learned, and Universal are getting better at making serials. So whereas as you said, they were trying to appeal to a more adult audience maybe in the mid-30s, but at this point you can tell they're hitting all the bases. They want to hit all the audience markets as evenly as possible. So if kids are enjoying it, then let's throw a young character in there that they can relate to, and maybe they'll be even more interested and we can squeeze more out of them.
And that appealing to younger audiences was seen when they sort of the precursor to this, the original film, came out, and this was like a 10-minute film called Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, an interplanetary battle with the Tiger Men of Mars. That is such a mouthful, Jesus. So that came out before this, but basically it wasn't like a film serial. It was a short 10-minute film, like I said, which was premiering at the World's Fair in Chicago, and that was used to promote toys. And if you watch this film, you can find it on YouTube. There's really not much in it. It's basically just all shot in a tiny little set, and it's got the character of Dr. Hewer taking lead, and he's just showing this little model aircraft, which I'm assuming you can buy like a toy version, and he's going like, it's got a ray gun. Buck comes in, talks all over the Doctor because no one's got any cues, and it all looks really like quickly made. Wilma's there as well, and then they say, the Tiger Men are attacking. They run off, and then the Doctor is basically narrating this space battle, which you see happen with all of these models, you can't really work out what's going on. And then that's the entire film. And
Wow.
it's interesting just the fact that was originally conceived as a way of promoting the toys. Again, you see this stuff with space opera later on when Star Wars starts all the merchandising for that. And there is just something about space opera which, again, appeals to younger audiences, but is also highly commercialized in this way. You can really sell it in all of these different facets, and you'll get like Star Wars lunchboxes later on. And Buck Rogers was kind of the first space opera kind of series to do that.
Yeah, it's a good genre for having a big cast of characters that you might want a different action figure of, if that's going to be made available. Lots of gadgets that could be recreated, the ray guns, the ships. Maybe not the helmets. I can't see that. Maybe.
Maybe not the robot helmets. But.
Yeah, but lots of tech, and even they've got quite iconic outfits as well, or easily imitable outfits that I imagine could be very popular with young audiences as well. You can imagine like a kid dressed up as Buck, can't you? Or Flash as well. Like it all works, doesn't it?
And this doesn't have as many of the fantasy elements that we see in Flash Gordon, but you do see one alien race briefly in this, the Zergs. What did you think about the Zergs on Saturn? And just what do you think of Saturn in general?
Well, the Saturnians would they be aliens as well, or are they just supposed to be humans? Everyone looks human, really. Yeah. But I assume they were supposed to be aliens as well. So we've got this kind of like upper class and underclass, haven't we, of on Saturn. We've got the Saturnians who are in charge, and then there's this kind of... What are the creatures in the time machine?
The Morlocks.
The Morlocks, right? They're a little bit like that. They kind of reminded me of that, but not as threatening. They were kind of chilled out, but easily swayed to violence.
Yeah, they say right at the start, like that they're great workers, but don't get on the wrong side of them or something, or like they can get really violent if you tell them to, or there's some sort of warning that they say in the first few episodes.
And it comes to pass, doesn't it? Because they're kind of utilized by the bad guys to do no good towards the end. Don't they sort of believe that one of the robots is a god? I was losing track of what was going on, to be honest, at this point in the serial. Why were they thinking that?
I'm not sure exactly, but again, it comes down to sort of mind control towards the end, doesn't it? And all of these robot helmets that are being used, and then the Zergs are under the influence. Always mind control. But the planet of Saturn as well, I was just like, why did they pick Saturn? Obviously, it's the most interesting looking planet, if you're looking at it from a stylistic point.
I should have looked this up. I was trying to figure out when scientists learned that Saturn was a gas giant. And because I feel like that was known, it would have been known by the 30s, but I guess not common knowledge. Or I guess ultimately I just thought, well, it's entirely possible that the people who made this just don't care, because it's not really, it's not important to Buck's adventure, so no. It's not something to be worried about.
But that look of Saturn as well, the idea of it being like a desert planet, and it was the same in Flash Gordon, like the planet that they're on looks very sort of desert-like, this kind of barren landscape that you see. And again, I was just thinking of Star Wars the entire time watching this, because it looks like Tatooine in Star Wars, and even the Zergs look like a character that you would see in Mos Eisley in that. But also the transitions that they use in both this and Flash Gordon. Did you clock that? They're exactly the same, aren't they?
Yeah, I think Flash has got like an iconic kind of lightning bolt transition, and Buck Rogers is more... There's a variety, I think, a bit more like Star Wars does.
Yeah.
But yeah, and obviously the opening crawl is much more directly linked to Star Wars, because it is literally, it's the same thing as what Star Wars does, whereas Flash Gordon just had title cards explaining what happened in the previous episode. It looks great, doesn't it? But what's weird is that it's now totally associated with Star Wars, whereas it's a complete necessity. In this, you have to have those opening things so that audiences who didn't watch, didn't go to the cinema the previous week, are caught up to speed and know what's going on. Whereas it's essentially, I don't know, it's an affectation in Star Wars, isn't it? It's certainly in the first one, when George Lucas made A New Hope, there was nothing to catch the audience up on.
Yeah, he didn't know it was going to be a film trilogy, did he?
Yeah, it's pure affectation to make it look like Buck Rogers for style's sake, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's just so iconic, though, that crawling text that comes up. And you just think about how much sci-fi cinema has used that aspect since, because it's just a tool for explaining away all the exposition of a film now. You'll always see some sort of text on screen beforehand, but this is the early use of it in these film serials, just to explain away, why are they on this planet? Who the hell is Buck Rogers? I've just come to the cinema to watch the thing after this. I don't know what's going on. Tell me in this short little crawl, and then I'll be able to figure it out.
But it also predates that as well, doesn't it? Because as you were saying, this is not long after the advent of sound. So most cinema up to this point had a good deal of its exposition through text on screen. Dialogue and exposition would be done that way. So they're just using the tools that are familiar to the kind of cinematic storytelling arsenal, and they're using it to just catch audiences up in a really practical way in these serials.
I don't understand, sir. Who is this man called Killer Kane?
He is the result of the stupidity of the men of your century. You failed to stamp out lawlessness, and in the end, the criminal became stronger than the law. Racketeers, you call them. Today, they rule the world as cruelly as they ruled their gangs in your day.
Well, isn't there any chance of help from an outside source?
Only from men on some other planet.
Another planet? That doesn't sound very hopeful.
It could be.
I think the main difference with this to Flash Gordon as well is that with Buck Rogers, you've got this real idea of a resistance, whereas in Flash Gordon, it was kind of him and his mates. You don't really get a big uprising, do you? Whereas in this, you've got all of the people of Earth have this underground resistance. It's like an underground hidden fortress, hidden temple, hidden place where they're hiding out. And they have, even the entrance is behind a mountain that has to open up in order to get in there. And I think this idea of a rebellion and uprising against this evil dictator is something which has become so akin with what you expect in a space opera now. You expect rebels and resistances and all of this kind of stuff. And I was really fascinated by that, seeing that in this, and this, because also the Dr. Hewer I think he's a bigger character in the comics. I wasn't really struck by him in the serial. He's just sort of there a few times. There's lots of other commandery kind of guys in this resistance. But I was wondering how you felt about the rebels and the way they were kind of depicted in this.
Yeah, I think you're right. They're an interesting facet of Buck Rogers in particular, because they're so fully formed, and you have this pre-existing rebellion like the rebels in Star Wars and a pre-existing empire. You've got that set up, and then our heroes just drop into it and kind of experience that conflict and interact with it. Whereas Flash is the instigator of the rebellion. And you're right, we don't really get that. He just has his mates basically at the end of the film. I quite like that setup, but I think both work, and both sort of fit the space opera mold. You have a sense of rebellion against an evil empire in both of them. It's just, it's a lot more structured in Buck's world than it is in Flash's world, who has to seed that rebellion himself. Yeah,
and if we're looking at sort of the space opera checklist as well, this doesn't tick as many boxes as Flash Gordon did, I don't think, because there's not really a man or woman who's fairer than the skies. There's not that big love interest in this as there was in Flash Gordon.
No, but I like Wilma more than Dale. Although, I mean, Wilma's, I guess, more like Aura, isn't she? Because she's kind of a more interesting character. I think Dale is the fair maiden, she's that kind of character. But I'm much more interested in a Wilma who, is kind of just has a personality.
And I mean, to sort of combat that, they've got all the space travel. There's lots of travelling to and from Saturn.
There's every single deal of travelling to and from Saturn. I mean, by the end of the amount of times they've gone back and forth to Saturn, to be honest with you, I think that's one of the reasons I didn't like it as much as Flash Gordon. It really is. And what I was talking about at the start, they're both very repetitive, but Flash Gordon has this overall story arc, and we meet mostly new characters, as we go along, whereas Buck is just bouncing back and forth between Saturn. Is Prince Talon going to sign a treaty with us or with Killer Kane? Whose side is he on this week? Is he brainwashed? I found all that more repetitive than moving through the locations of Flash Gordon to a conclusion. Yeah, it was just so much back and forthing. There's only sort of like 3 different places they go to. They go to Killer Kane City, they go to Saturn, and then they go to the hidden city, and that's it. And it's just bouncing around the whole time. And a lot of it does play out the same way. They go to Saturn, they talk to the tribunal, whatever they are. They say no, they say yes at the end. Hooray. It's a lot of that. And again, it's a problem with binge watching something that was designed to be watched over 12 weeks. You wouldn't be bothered by the fact that he's just going back to Saturn. In fact, you'd expect him to be going back to Saturn because last week he wasn't on Saturn. So you're like, okay, well, we should have a Saturn episode next. Let's go to Saturn. So that would be a lot less bothersome if you weren't watching it. And we're watching it in the wrong way. So I've got an issue with it that's unjust, I suppose. And the fact that you've got Larry Buster Crabbe playing both these characters, but they both seem really different to me. I know there's a lot of factors involved. There's the storyline, what's happening with all the other people in the films, but there is just something, I don't know, there's something more larger than life about Flash Gordon and what he's doing and the sort of his physical attributes and everything that he's giving in that respect. Whereas Buck just seems, he's more calculated in what he's doing and he's very professional, but there isn't just that, I don't know, there's just something about Flash which just makes it more iconic in a lot of ways to me. I think, yeah, I agree. I think simplifying the characters makes them more iconic. I think trying to make them more complex cuts away from that in a way that is not helpful for the serial and for the character. And thinking about how they could become more complex, we will be revisiting both of these characters later on in the series when we look at Flash Gordon, the film which came out later in the 80s. And we'll also be looking at the film version of Buck Rogers, which predates the series which came out as well. So we're going to take a look at those later on. It'll be interesting to see what they do with these characters now that we've seen these early versions of them in the film serials. Yeah, and it'll be really fun to watch 2 incredibly nostalgic properties for me with some extra information about them now as well, now that I know the kind of more of the genesis of them and see how they compare, I guess. Yeah, I'm really interested in seeing how the stylizing of those characters progresses and happens in those later films. But yes, that is an episode which is coming later in the series. But we do have another episode for you coming up before you know it. Yes, next time on the show, we're going to be looking at some shipwrecks in space. And to explore that theme, we'll be watching some classic episodes of the original Lost in Space TV series from the 1960s and Disney's The Black Hole from 1979. I'm really interested to look at these 2 pieces of science fiction because Lost in Space, a 60s series, we're looking at stuff like the space race, what it was like in TV at that time, what the landscape was like, looking at a family going into space, which I think would be an interesting thing to see on screen. Yeah, that should be a good bit of fun. And I've never seen The Black Hole and I don't know anything about it, James, so I'm going in totally blind to that one. Yeah, The Black Hole, directed by Gary Nelson, who also did Freaky Friday, so a Disney guy. Credentials. Yeah, credentials. Yes, it's going to be interesting to see that. And obviously with The Black Hole, looking at how 70s sci-fi changed after Star Wars. And I've got a suspicion The Black Hole has a little bit to owe to the Star Wars franchise. Very interesting. Okay, well, join us for that, listeners. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening to this episode of Journey Through Sci-Fi. You can find us at journeythroughsci-fi.com, where you can find links to our social media and join the conversation. If you've enjoyed what you've heard and want to support us, why not leave us a review on your podcast app of choice? It really helps new people find the show. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi, where you can receive exclusive bonus episodes every month. Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and we'll see you again next time for another Journey Through Sci-Fi.